Drake really had a whole verse lined up for the game, and the game allegedly looked at it and said, "Nah, not on my watch," then pulled it off no breaks because, in his words, he was trying to protect the West Coast. And that right there is the part that should make you uncomfortable, because it flips the entire story y'all think you're watching. The popular version is Drake is the master chess player, Kendrick Lamar is the silent boogeyman, and everybody else is just collateral. But if the game is openly admitting there were other versions of that record that weren't too kind, then what does that say about what Drake was really trying to do with that feature in this exact moment? Because this isn't just about a deleted verse. This is about leverage. This is about bait. This is about the algorithm king, yeah, I'm calling him that, trying to turn one coast into a prop to poke at one man, while his loudest online megaphone, the chat room press secretary himself, DJ Academics, plays innocent like he wasn't out here just asking questions until Drake magically posts the album days later. And here's the layered mystery. The game says he removed it to protect the coast. Academics says he didn't nudge Drake. And yet, the timing, the revisions, and the way fans are already begging for a leak makes it feel like this whole thing was engineered to end in one place. And when we get to that one line the game says about altering the album to keep the focus on music, it tells you who this was really gonna hurt and why the missing verse might be the most revealing thing about Drake's current position in hip-hop right now. Because if it drops, it doesn't just start drama, it changes the scoreboard. Drop your thoughts in the comments, hit like and subscribe. Let's get into it. So, let's lay out what's happening without the fan fiction goggles on. The headline is simple. The game and Drake have a record called No Breaks, and the game is on camera saying there may have been a Drake verse that didn't make the final cut. Not only that, he implies there were multiple versions floating around during the process, and that at least some of them crossed the line. He frames the decision like he was trying to keep the album's focus on music instead of beef, and he even uses language that sounds like he's trying to keep bigger consequences from landing on the West Coast as a whole. At the same time, you've got the internet doing what it always does, turning a creative decision into a scoreboard. Drake fans, people who treat every interaction like a playoff series, immediately start asking the only question they care about. Where's the verse? Not, is this smart? Not, is this safe? Not, does this help anybody? Just leak it. Because for the stan culture, a leak isn't a breach of trust. It's content. It's a win. It's a screenshot. It's something to spam under every post until the timeline feels like it belongs to them again. And then, like clockwork, DJ Academics steps into the middle of it and tries to do that thing he always does, act like he's just narrating while also steering the car. He addresses the idea that he pressured Drake to post the game's album, denies having anything to do with it, and basically sells the "Drake is a real dude, he'll do it regardless" angle. But the problem is, the timing makes that hard to swallow for anybody who's watched this media ecosystem work for more than 10 minutes. And zoom out, because you have to. This sits inside a bigger West Coast versus outsider tension that hip-hop always falls into when the stakes get hot. Anytime there's even a whiff of West Coast politics, people start moving like it's 1996 again. Except now, the battleground is Instagram stories, podcast clips, and algorithmic dog piles. So the real stakes aren't just, did Drake diss Kendrick? The stakes are, was Drake trying to use a West Coast artist to deliver a message into a West Coast climate, then hide behind plausible deniability when the reaction got messy? Was the game trying to play neutral while still poking the bear? And as Academics, OVO megaphone, chat room press secretary, pick your favorite, pretending he's not part of the pressure system that turns these decisions into headline moments? Because if this was really just music, nobody would be acting like a missing verse is a national security issue. So what's the play here, and who benefits if that verse magically appears? Now, let's talk about what we can actually point to, visible, verifiable stuff, before we get into the whispers in the industry machine. First piece of surface evidence is the clip itself. The game, in a recent interview clip that's been circulating, is asked directly if there's a Drake verse we haven't heard that was supposed to be on No Breaks, and his answer is not a hard no. He says maybe, then follows it up by talking about pulling it off, saying he didn't need it, and, this is the key part, bringing up that there were about 3 versions, and that some other versions, they weren't really too kind. Then he says he pulled certain things off the album, and altered the album a lot to keep the focus on music instead of beef. Does everybody understand how crazy that is? That's not we couldn't clear the sample. That's not scheduling didn't work out. That's I heard what you were doing on my record, and I made an executive decision. And if you're the game, a guy with a long history of inserting himself into big moments, you don't say that on camera unless you want the world to know you had to stop something from happening. Second piece of surface evidence is the public reaction pattern that followed immediately after that clip started making rounds. You can literally watch the conversation split into 2 lanes in real time. Lane 1 is people saying, respect, he kept it from escalating, treating the game like he did a public service. Lane 2 is the Drake Stan lane. We need that version. Leak it. They're scared. The coast can't handle it. All the usual manufactured bravado. And the reason that matters is because a leak culture doesn't just happen by accident anymore. Fans begging for a leak is part of how leaks get normalized, justified, and eventually weaponized as the people demanded it. And that ties into the third piece of surface evidence, the academic segment where he addresses Drake posting the game's album later than people expected. In the circulating clip, Academics basically tries to wash his hands. He says he can't make that call, Drake is a real dude, and he didn't tell Drake to do anything. But even inside his own explanation, the pressure is obvious. When you are the biggest hip-hop media platform in that lane and you put a narrative out there, why didn't he post it? You don't get to pretend you didn't add weight to the scale. You are the scale. And the timeline is what makes this feel less like coincidence. The album is out, days pass, people notice Drake hasn't posted it, Academics speaks on it, then Drake posts it. Is that definitive proof Academics called him? No, but it is surface-level evidence of cause and effect in the attention economy. And if you're being honest, it looks like the chat room press secretary did what he always does, apply public pressure while claiming he's just watching the game. Now stack those 3 pieces together, the game saying he pulled unkind versions, the fans immediately mobilizing around Leak It, and Academics doing his innocence theater while the timing looks suspicious. And you start to see why this story won't die. Because the next question becomes, if the verse was pulled for protection, protection from what? A diss? A threat? A legal headache? A cultural backlash? Or the simplest answer, protection from Drake embarrassing himself again by forcing a Kendrick Lamar narrative into yet another moment? And yeah, I said it, because at a certain point, strategic starts looking like desperate. And oh, do I have more for you. Because the part that really tells on everybody isn't even the missing verse. It's how quickly the surrounding cast started spinning the meaning of it like it's a Marvel post-credit scene. And to the algorithm king fans who are already typing coping with shaking hands, save it. If this was such a fearless master plan, why are you begging for a leak like it's oxygen? If the verse is so catastrophic, why doesn't anybody with actual accountability want it on the official record? And speaking of accountability, we need to talk about the other clip that got way less attention, the game responding to a breakdown. Shout out to reaction channels like Knox Hill who actually analyze bars, where the game essentially confirms what a lot of people already suspected, that the poking wasn't accidental, it was meant to provoke. So now we move from what we can see to what the culture is saying behind it. One of the biggest cultural evidence pieces here is the game's own framing of motive, because he's trying to do 2 things at the same time, and they contradict each other. On one hand, he's presenting himself like the grown-up in the room. I altered the album to focus on music, less on BS. I'm not dissing anyone. Protect the coast. That's the responsible elder statesman version of the game. But the culture knows the game. The culture has receipts on the game. This is the same artist with a long track record of orbiting controversy, naming names, and inserting himself into conversations he doesn't technically have to be in. So when he says, I'm not dissing anyone, while people are pulling bars and references they interpret as shots, it lands like a half smile in a police lineup. Like, okay, sure, you might not be dissing directly, but you're absolutely doing that thing where you want the smoke without having to sign for the package. Second cultural evidence piece is the provoke kindred admission energy that came from the response to bar breakdowns. In the circulating discussion, the idea is that the game's lyrics and references were designed to get Kendrick Lamar to react, to pull him into the conversation. And culturally, that's important because it reflects the current hierarchy in rap. Kendrick doesn't have to do anything to be the center of gravity. He can be quiet and still control the room. That makes some people furious, especially people whose brand depends on constant motion, constant posts, constant headlines. So when the game is seen as poking that silence, the culture reads it as clout gravity. Not friendly competition, not sparring, gravity. If Kendrick responds, the moment becomes bigger. If Kendrick stays quiet, the other side can pretend he's scared and farm that narrative anyway. Either way, the provocateur wins attention. Third cultural evidence piece is the West Coast internal conversation that immediately pops up whenever an outsider, or a perceived outsider, tries to use West Coast names and platforms during a heated moment. Even in comment sections, you see people saying things like, "Protect the coast," "Don't bring that here," and referencing past collaborations like 100 as examples of how quickly a feature can become a political statement. That's not just fandom, that's regional identity, and it comes with real-world consequences. Now, I want to be clear. It's completely possible Drake wrote a verse that was simply too aggressive for the moment, and the game, whether out of genuine concern or self-preservation, decided it wasn't worth it. That's a fair counterargument. It's also possible the verse was weak or didn't fit the record, and "Protect the Coast" is just a cleaner story to tell the internet than "My boy sent me something mid." But here's why that counterargument collapses under the culture's own logic. The game didn't say it didn't fit. He didn't say it wasn't the vibe. He said there were versions that weren't too kind, and he framed it like an intentional effort to move away from beef. That implies content. That implies direction. That implies a message. And culturally, once you imply a message, people will fill in the blanks with the most dramatic version possible. That's why Drake fans immediately start clamoring for the deleted version, because in their minds it has to be the nuke. And Kendrick fans don't even have to do anything, because the very act of begging for a leak makes the other side look like they're chasing. And then there's academics, the corrupt ally archetype in this whole universe. Because culturally, academics doesn't just report stories, he manufactures urgency. He turns minor timing quirks into morality plays. Real friends post, fake friends don't. Why didn't Kendrick post this person? All that false equivalency stuff. And you can see how people use his framing to build narratives that don't even match the facts on the ground, like comparing someone posting a project they're featured on to someone posting an album they aren't on. That's not analysis, that's propaganda with a laugh track. So where does that leave us culturally? It leaves us with a messy triangle. The game wants to be seen as neutral but still important. Drake, Mr. Subtweet, the algorithm king, wants to keep pressure on Kendrick without stepping into the line of fire directly. Academics wants to keep access, keep relevance, and keep his position as the loudest amplifier, while pretending the amplifier isn't shaping the sound. And that's the moment right before the gear shift, because once you see how the culture is reacting, you have to ask the system question. Why does a missing verse become a bigger story than the music itself? Quick mid-script calibration for pacing. We're roughly in the 2,300 to 2,500 word range right here, which is exactly where a 19 to 22-minute script needs to be before the business pivot. Now let's hit the pattern interrupt. Here's where people mess up the analysis, because they keep treating this like it's only about ego and disses. But the real engine underneath all of this is business incentives, streaming incentives, media incentives, legal incentives. And once you see those, the "Protect the Coastline" reads less like poetry and more like risk management. Systemic angle number one is clearance, liability, and the quiet legal economy behind rap moments. When an artist says, "I pulled certain things off the album," that's not just artistic curation. That's a decision that involves management, label counsel, publishing, distribution, and sometimes insurers. People joke in comments like unkind versions might lead to litigation, but that joke is closer to reality than most fans realize. In 2026, disadjacent content can create real complications. Defamation concerns, threats being interpreted as credible, venue security issues, brand partners getting nervous, platforms flagging content, and most importantly, artists realizing that the internet doesn't just talk, it escalates. So if the game is sitting on multiple versions of a record, and one version includes lines that could be interpreted as direct provocation toward Kendrick Lamar or toward other West Coast names, he has to consider the downstream impact. Not just will this get streams, but will this get somebody hurt? Will this get my tour flagged? Will this get my release buried? Will this get me dragged into legal mess I don't want? That's why Protect the Coast hits differently. It's not necessarily the game acting like a savior. It's the game acting like someone who understands how fast a rap moment can turn into a real-world headache when the internet starts role-playing as soldiers.
Systemic angle number 2 is the attention economy and how media friends function as unofficial marketing arms. Academics saying, "I can't tell Drake what to do" is technically true in the literal sense, but it's misleading in the only sense that matters. He can absolutely shape the environment Drake is making decisions inside. Think about how modern rollouts work. You don't just drop music, you drop narratives. You seed talking points through clips. You let fans discover mysteries. You let reaction channels and large platforms do free labor by turning your moments into debates. And you use ambiguity, maybe, other versions, pulled it off, as gasoline. Because ambiguity is engagement. Engagement is algorithmic reach. Algorithmic reach is streaming conversion. That's why the leak conversation is not just fan noise. Leaks are a parallel distribution system now. A leak can test public reaction without officially owning the consequences. A leak can give you plausible deniability. A leak can let you apply pressure while acting like you didn't. And in a weird way, a leak can even function like a marketing beat. OMG, did you hear the deleted verse becomes the headline, and the official release becomes the footnote. So when Drake fans beg for a leak, they're not just being impatient. They're participating in a system that rewards unauthorized content because it creates the feeling of forbidden access. And if you're the algorithm king, Mr. Subtweet, and your whole brand right now is staying talked about, a leak benefits you, even if it makes you look messy, because messy still trends. Now connect the two systemic angles. If the verse is too aggressive, too pointed, too risky, the game has business reasons to pull it. And if it's pulled, Drake has incentive to let the mystery linger, because the mystery fuels engagement without him having to stand on the official record. Academics then becomes the middle layer, the attention broker, who can keep the story alive every night on stream without anyone signing legal responsibility for what's being implied. And that brings us to the most important part. The idea that this was to protect the West Coast might not be about protecting Kendrick at all. It might be about protecting Drake. Because here's the uncomfortable truth about this era. Kendrick Lamar doesn't need to respond to win the day. The culture already treats him like the silent final boss. The moment Drake is seen chasing, provoking, or engineering ways to get a reaction, it reads like insecurity, not strategy, and that's deadly for a brand built on being unbothered. So if Drake sent a verse that was clearly angled, allegedly angled, at Kendrick on a West Coast artist's record during a moment when the temperature is already high, and the game chose not to carry that message, then Drake doesn't just lose a feature, he loses a vehicle, he loses a storyline, he loses a chance to reframe the conversation. And that's why the timing of the album post matters, because if Drake truly felt good about the relationship and the moment, posting the game's album would be effortless. But if Drake felt slighted, like "you didn't let me do what I came to do," then suddenly the post becomes political, it becomes emotional, it becomes a negotiation. And you can tell me I'm reaching, but ask yourself this. Why does this whole situation feel like everyone is trying to say the least while implying the most? Because that's what the machine does when it wants maximum attention with minimum accountability.
Now we get to the payoff, the thing the hook promised, what this missing verse actually reveals about the power dynamics right now. The truth bomb is this: the deleted Drake verse story is not primarily about who dissed who, it's about who currently has control over the environment. When the game says he removed the verse to protect the West Coast, he's accidentally revealing that Drake, the algorithm king, Mr. Subtweet, doesn't fully control the narrative the way people assume he does. Because if he did, the verse would be on the song, the rollout would be clean, the moment would be his. Instead, we're watching a scenario where a West Coast artist can look at Drake's contribution and say, this doesn't serve me, this doesn't serve the coast, this doesn't serve the album, and he can actually remove it. That is a power check, not a lyrical check, a power check. And it also exposes how fragile the current media ecosystem is, because the minute the verse is missing, the entire conversation becomes about what we didn't get. Not about the games project, not about the actual music, not about craft, about absence. That's manufactured, that's engineered, that's the attention economy eating art in real time. Here's where it gets even more revealing. If the verse magically leaks, it gives everyone what they want without anyone owning the decision. Drake gets the diss out without officially stamping it. The game gets to say he tried to prevent it. Academics gets to run 4 streams off it while saying, I'm just covering it. Fans get to pick sides and role-play civil war in the comments. The machine gets engagement. Everybody wins, except the culture, because the culture gets trained again to value drama over music. And if it doesn't leak, that also tells a story. It tells you the people closest to the record understand the consequences of letting it out. It tells you the unkind version might be so flagrant that it crosses from rap talk into something that triggers security, legal, or
Platform issues. Allegedly. Reportedly. Based on how people around it are talking, it's at least plausible that it's not just a bar, it's a liability. So the missing verse is a mirror. It reflects that Drake's current strategy relies heavily on pressure without presence. Keep the conversation hot, keep the mystery alive, but avoid standing in the official spotlight long enough to be measured against the last big outcome. And that's why Kendrick Lamar staying quiet is actually the most devastating thing in the room. Because the quieter Kendrick is, the more everyone else starts talking themselves into circles trying to force a reaction that may never come. Now, where does that leave the hero and villain in our little universe? It leaves Kendrick Lamar as the guy who's still winning without even being outside. Not because he's above it all in some corny, worshipful way, because the evidence of this story shows it. If the entire internet has to speculate about a deleted verse to feel like momentum exists, that's not dominance, that's hunger, that's chasing. Meanwhile, Drake, the algorithm king, Mr. Subtweet, is stuck playing 2 games at once. He wants the intimidation factor of, I'll say it on a verse, but he also wants the safety of, I never officially said it. And that contradiction is exactly where artists start looking manufactured. Because real confidence doesn't need plausible deniability. And the game? The game is the game. He wants to be the mediator and the instigator, the neutral party and the headline, the protector and the provocateur. And honestly, that's why this situation is so on brand it's almost funny. He's saying, I'm protecting the coast with one breath, and with the other breath, the culture is watching him confirm he was trying to provoke Kendrick. That's not neutrality. That's a business model. And academics, the chat room press secretary, is doing what corrupt allies always do, pretending the megaphone isn't part of the war. But the reason people don't buy it is simple, because the moment he talks, the narrative moves. You don't get to be the weather and then act shocked when it rains. So, here's the contrast one-liner that sums the whole thing up. Kendrick doesn't have to pull a verse to control the room. Other people pull verses because they're scared of what happens when his name is involved. And I know that's going to make some of y'all mad, but tell me where the lie is. If Drake was so unstoppable in this moment, we wouldn't be discussing what got removed. We'd be discussing what landed. What I think is happening here is the culture is slowly course-correcting in real time.
People are getting tired of manufactured tension, tired of propaganda rollouts, tired of mystery bars, tired of the same ecosystem where drama is the product. And the more people feel that fatigue, the more the artist who moves with discipline, drop, disappear, let the work breathe, starts looking like the last real heavyweight in the room. Now, does that mean this story is over? Not even close. Because this is only the start of the next phase, the leak phase, the narrative phase, the who's really independent, who's really pressured, who's really posting for who phase. If that verse leaks, watch who amplifies it first. Watch who acts surprised. Watch who suddenly has sources. Watch how fast the story shifts from music decision to coast politics. And if it doesn't leak, watch how long people keep begging, because the begging itself tells you who feels like they need a moment more than they need a record. And if you want a concrete thing to track next, it's this. Does Drake keep showing public love to West Coast associates the way he normally would, or does he get weird and selective? Do we see more bait records and sub-energy, or do we see an actual direct move that can be judged on the official scoreboard? Because the longer this stays in the shadows, the more it feels like a grift instead of a strategy. So stay locked in, because the next video we need to talk about is the part nobody wants to say out loud. If a single missing verse can shake up this many narratives, what happens when a real piece of behind-the-scenes info drops? Like who approved what, who cleared what, and who's quietly trying to use media platforms as unofficial leverage? That one is going to connect dots people swear aren't connected. And by the time it's done, you're going to look at the entire missing verse saga like it was the warning shot, not the event.